There is a persistent assumption in luxury that growth requires softening your message for mass appeal, that in order to scale, a brand must become more legible, more universal, and more broadly appealing. Over time, that often translates into a gradual erosion of point of view. But the brands shaping culture right now are not following that pattern. If anything, they're becoming more defined, more committed to their own internal logic. I've been looking closely at a few brands that are doing this with unusual clarity. Danessa Myricks Beauty, Andrea Iyamah, and Christopher John Rogers. They operate in different parts of the market, beauty, resort wear, and ready-to-wear, but they share a common discipline. Each has built cultural authority without diluting the perspective that made them distinct in the first place. In this talk, we'll go through a brief analysis of each founder and brand, and then move into a synthesis of the three with the takeaways that we've observed as brand strategists. Danessa Myricks did not come up through a traditional beauty pathway. She began in corporate, and her entry point into makeup was observational. She was watching artists on set, watching how they worked, how they moved, and how they transformed a face. What stayed with her was not just the outcome, but the sense of authorship. She started at 30, self-taught, no institutional training, no inherited framework for what, quote, good makeup was supposed to look like. And early on, she moved through a phase that is familiar to most creatives, studying other artists closely, trying to replicate what already existed. The shift came when she recognized that imitation would only ever position her brand as someone else's vision. What changed her trajectory was not technical mastery, but a reorientation towards instinct. She began building from feeling rather than reference. That orientation is still present in the product. Her formulations are not designed as single-use categories. They are built as tools, multifunctional, adaptable, and intentionally open-coded. Color Fix, for example, is less a product than a system. It reflects a way of working, not just a finished look. At the same time, her approach to inclusion is not framed as an afterthought or corrective. It's foundational. It comes directly from her own experience navigating a market that did not initially account for her. The result is a brand that reads as both highly personal and widely usable, not because it has been simplified, but because it has been constructed with enough depth to hold variation. Her marketing approach reinforces this. I met Danessa several years ago when she was speaking at a Harvard Business School conference. What struck me at the time, and has only become more apparent since, is how deliberately she brings her audience into process. As she evolves as both a business owner and a makeup artist, she documents that evolution in real time. There is very little separation between the work and the learning. In that sense, the products begin to function less as standalone items and more as tools within a broader system of practice. They are materials through which her audience can participate in the same experimentation, refinement, and discovery that she is moving through herself. What she has built is not a beauty brand in the conventional sense, it's a practice. Authority, in this case, comes from clarity of method. Andrea Iyamah began her brand at 17 years old while still in school. From the outset, the intention was explicit: to build an African-owned brand that could operate internationally without losing its cultural grounding. What is noticeable is how little that intention has shifted. The brand has expanded across product categories, across geographies, but the underlying language has remained consistent. Color, silhouette, material, and setting are all tightly controlled. There is a clear visual logic that carries through each collection. Rather than explaining its cultural references, the brand embeds them. The influence of travel, nature, and African diasporic identity is present, but it is expressed through form rather than narrative. This is what allows it to travel. Operating across cities like Toronto, Lagos, and New York, the brand has reached a global audience without recalibrating its core identity. It has not broadened its message in order to scale, it's refined it. And expansion, in this case, is not a matter of reaching further. It's a matter of building a world that is coherent enough to be entered. Christopher John Rogers' rise is often described as rapid, but the underlying story reveals consistent growth that surely felt slow at times when he was living it, and a methodical rise. Christopher began by making work independently, designing and producing garments while working another full-time job, often constructing pieces himself. There was no immediate infrastructure or institutional support. What he did have was a clear aesthetic position. Color, volume, and a particular sense of exuberance have been present from the beginning. He describes his work as pragmatic glamour, a balance between expressiveness and wearability. Importantly, that position did not shift in response to prevailing trends. At a time when minimalism dominated the market, his work remained maximal in some way. Even when using a neutral color palette, his pieces were voluminous and noticeable. I think of a beautiful knit sweater that I own from one of his New York sample sales. It is anything but plain. Even with a simple premise, it's almost comically oversized, has whimsical buttons and dramatic sleeves. When his designs were described as excessive or out of step, he continued to develop them anyway. And over time, that consistency became legibility. The work is now immediately recognizable because it has been repeated, refined, and reinforced across collections. Recognition is not achieved through adaptation alone. It's built through sustained commitment to a point of view. Across all three brands, a consistent pattern emerges in their strategic posture. Each brand has resisted the impulse to generalize itself in order to grow. Instead, they've invested in becoming more precise, more internally coherent, and more legible on their own terms. Several principles begin to take shape. Specificity creates gravity. The clearer the internal logic of a brand, the less it needs to explain itself externally. Product operates as the primary language. Before narrative, before marketing, there's the work itself. What is made and how it is made and how it's used. Consistency compounds over time. Repetition, when it's intentional, does not produce redundancy. It produces recognition. And lastly, cultural perspective, when it's articulated with care, does not limit a brand's reach, it strengthens it. I'm certain that it hasn't been lost on anyone that all three of these brands are Black-owned. While this analysis is not about diversity in a surface sense, that context matters. Luxury, particularly in fashion and beauty, has long been shaped by the aesthetics and labor of women in queer communities. And yet ownership within that same system has remained disproportionately narrow. Black ownership, especially at the level of global recognition and scale, is still underrepresented. What makes these brands compelling then is not simply their presence within that landscape, but how they are operating within it. They are not expanding by diluting their perspective or softening their cultural grounding. If anything, the opposite is true. Their specificity is the strategy. And that's where the lesson opens up, not just for Black-owned brands, but for any emerging luxury brand with a distinct point of view. The path to cultural authority is not through broad appeal. It is through clarity, consistency, and a willingness to remain legible to yourself first. The luxury market is, in many ways, recalibrating. After a period of growth driven largely by scale, price hikes, and accessibility in some cases, there is a renewed emphasis on authorship, on clarity of vision, on distinctiveness, on brands that know what they are and remain consistent in that knowing. The brands that we've looked at didn't pivot to meet that shift. They were already operating within it. And that, more than anything, is what makes them instructive. For many emerging brands, the challenge is not a lack of ideas. It is lack of structure around those ideas, how they are translated into product, into image, into a system that can hold as the brand grows. And that's the work. Understanding what is essential, building around it with enough discipline that it can scale, is something we spend a great deal of time thinking about in the work that we do with clients. If this is something that you're navigating within your own brand, there is so much more to explore there. Reach out. We would love to have a conversation about your specifics.